Sam Armstrong, first of all, is there a cunning plot to unite the right, a bid to get through the local elections at the beginning of May, where Reform hoped that, well, they were certainly hoping they would win them if all of the councils that were going to have local elections had actually put up all the seats, but we know lots of major local councils which would have fallen very well for Reform UK will not be going ahead with their local elections due to major reforms. And that's kind of a Labour-Tory agreement, some would say, a nice little deal. But idea is that Kemi Badenoch, her Tory party not doing very well, behind Reform and Labour in the polls still, could do badly. The move to unite the right and oust Kemi Badenoch. Is that happening?
Well, let's start with the physical mechanics of the polling. At present, Nigel Farage has had his own personal poll ratings have gone down a little bit over the past month for two reasons, I think. Some of it on Rupert Lowe, some of it on Ukraine, Russia, Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So, but you're now in a position in which after all of that, Reform's poll ratings as a party have not been hit. If anything, they've ticked up another 1 point. And I think you're now in a position in which the Tory party and the Reform party are both sat around 20 to 27 points in the polls, and that figure is just not going to change. Now, the trouble comes with the British electoral system, which is first past the post.
Yep.
And basically, that punishes you incredibly hardly for being a divided philosophical movement. So the Labour Party has always been hit because you've had people going off to the Greens, to the Lib Dems, to whomever. And as a result, the Tories tend to have won more elections. You're now in a position in which, comparatively, the left of British politics is united, predominantly around the Labour Party. You're going to see them, I think, by the time of the next election, being on about 30 to 35% in the polls. Whereas the Tories and Reform stuck on 2025. All of that means that we are guaranteed another 5 years of Keir Starmer's government.
Right.
So the electoral incentive, the imperative for Reform and Tories, for one of two things to happen. Either that one of those parties wins out and comes through and dominates the other, or for some kind of pre-election as opposed to post-election arrangement is massive and overwhelming.
So in seats where Reform are likely to win, the Tories stand down. Where the Tories are likely to win, Reform stands down. Very interesting. Well, I wonder what you'd make of that. You give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Would you be in favour of some sort of unite the right pact? Love to also hear your thoughts on how you would reform disability benefits. Either way, same number to call, 0344 499 1000. Text the word talk and your message to 87222. Send us a message on X at talkTV. Calls are charged the national rate. Text cost £1, standard network rate message. Right, well, let's talk about all of this with Sir John Curtice. He's a polling expert, professor of politics at the University of Strathclyde. Good afternoon to you, Sir John.
Good afternoon,
Thank you for joining us. All right, there's lots to talk about because Reform right now are just hosting a press conference, and we understand that Nigel Farage he's welcomed 29 new councillors to Reform UK as ahead of the May local election campaign, people who have moved from other parties, largely, I think, the Tory party. We understand that they are hoping to get something like 200 seats in the local elections. So let's just focus on the local elections first up. First of all, how big an impact has the cancelled local elections in various different authorities? How big an impact is that going to have in terms of who is perceived to be the winner and the loser of these elections?
Probably not as much as Reform have been arguing. Yes, it's true that the elections have been cancelled in 9 councils, but we've still got 23 council elections. It's a relatively small bunch, but it was always going to be a relatively small bunch. Those are virtually all of them, apart from 3 of them, are councils that are controlled by the Conservatives. Yep. They will give us a pretty good test of the ability of Reform to do well in predominantly Conservative areas. At the same time, and intriguingly in contrast, there are also 6 mayoral contests, 4 of which have been defended by Labour, the other 2 are new. These are all much more in more Labour parts of the United Kingdom, and they will give us an opportunity to assess whether or not Reform can advance in more Labour parts of the country. So in a sense, there will be 2 rather different stories to look at.
Yeah.
And I think the truth is there's still going to be enough at stake that if indeed Reform are going to do well, they're going to demonstrate it. Actually, there is one potential advantage to Reform of there being fewer council elections. Of course, the big challenge to Reform, and it's one of the things I'll be interested in hearing in the wake of this press conference, is how many candidates are they going to put up? There are about 1,500 council seats being fought over on the 1st of May. And I think a real challenge to Reform is whether or not indeed they are fighting most of those or not. And the fact that there are now somewhat fewer councils balloting makes it rather easier perhaps for Reform to find the activists to stand.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's very interesting. But again, it's interesting how Reform are taking votes from not just the Tories, but also Labour. And there had been this view, I think, from lots of Labour folk, which was, well, you know, we're not really bothered by Reform. We can just criticise Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe, whoever else, slag them off. But it's not really affecting us because it's splitting the the right-wing vote, taking votes from the Tories. They know perfectly well that that would have massively harmed the Tories at the last election and helped that, I mean, huge, big, loveless, but nevertheless landslide that Labour won. So not a problem. But of course, it is if they can take Labour votes as well, then that's a very different kind of threat.
Well, life's a bit more complicated than that. It certainly is true that Reform are taking some votes off Labour. Actually, I think Labour's problem is much more fundamental than simply Nigel Farage. If you look at the polls, they are losing votes to everybody. They're losing votes to the Tories, they're losing votes to the Liberal Democrats, they're losing votes to the Greens. One of the problems facing Labour as a party that's tried to put itself in the centre of our politics is that does mean that as people become disillusioned, as they have become with the Labour government relatively quickly, they are at risk of going off to the left and to the right. The reason why Reform are potentially able to win Labour seats is not necessarily simply because they take votes off Labour, but whether or not they can take votes off the Conservatives in these seats. And certainly in the moment, you know, the national opinion polls still show Reform finding it easier to pick up votes off the Tories than they are off the Labour Party.
Right, that's very interesting. And how much should we read into these elections at the start of May? Because at the end of the day, you know, any government that gets elected will see a backlash in the polls. Fewer people vote in local elections than general elections, so it tends to be people who feel much more strongly, and you're often more likely to feel more strongly because you're cross about something. A lot of people view local elections, as they often do, and we'll come to by-elections as well in a moment, as kind of a free vote. Well, you know, I've got the government, I'm cross with something they're doing, but it's a free vote, doesn't really matter. So how much should we read into whatever the results are?
Well, I think the truth is they do provide valuable intelligence, but you do need to compare local elections with local elections. The most obvious point is that the Liberal Democrats always do better in local elections than they would do in any contemporaneous Westminster election. And that does therefore also tend to mean that Labour do less well than they would in a contemporaneous election. And of course, one other complication we've got with that comparison this time is, you know, the seats that are being fought this time were last contested in May 2021. That was the day when Boris Johnson won the Hartley-Brewer by-election and the Labour Party did badly. Now, that does therefore mean it is essentially the Conservatives in predominantly Conservative voting areas whose seats are on the line. They got about 900 of the 1,500 seats that are up for grab last night. So it is very much a defensive exercise. But at the end of the day, if Reform really are going to convince us that they are doing anything like as well as the national polls are saying, they A, need to find the activists, and B, they do need to be taking a significant number of seats off the Conservatives in these areas.
And let's talk about the likelihood of that and where Reform are in the polling. We've seen, opinion poll after opinion poll, which is routinely now putting certainly Reform ahead of the Tories, sometimes ahead of Labour as well. But again, as Sam Armstrong was touching on, our first past the post system does mean that actually you can, having 25% of the votes, depending on where they are in the country, has a very different outcome for different parties.
Well, indeed, but equally 25% the vote has a different outcome, whether as a result of that you're still third or whether or not you are first. So Reform's problem, quote unquote, is that their vote is geographically evenly spread, and that therefore, when they're running third, as they did last July, they find it difficult to convert votes into seats. But if you're at 20, if you've got a geographically evenly spread and you're at 25%, still a bit of a disadvantage, but it's going to become less of a disadvantage. And certainly, I've seen one projection, I don't necessarily speak for it, which suggests that Reform might manage to get over 400 seats in these local elections, because the point is, yes, they're only at 25%, but nobody else is at more than 25%.
Yeah.
And that is going to mean that in places, Reform are running first if they're matching their opinion poll position. And if you're first and you've got a geographically evenly spread vote, the system begins to work to your advantage.
Yeah, and it's certainly various incarnations of parties that Nigel Farage has led. He's got a very strong history, European elections and the like. And we know, the impact that has had on Tory policies and Tory party leaderships has been huge over the years. Of course, those elections, of course, were a proportional representation, not first past the post. So it's very, very different. We have got another first past the post test. So we've got the likelihood very soon, the Runcorn and Helsby by-election. This is the seat belonging to Mike Amesbury, who's standing down after being convicted of assault and getting a suspended, I don't know how, a suspended sentence. Reform seem to be polling ahead there. How big a big sort of, a big rocking of the system would it be if Reform actually won that by-election? Well,
let's pick up both the points you make. I think one of the fundamental things that Nigel Farage's various parties have never previously done is to really embed themselves strongly within our local government system. They had some success around 2013, 2014, 2015. But the real question is, during the course of this parliament, can they become as much of the architecture of local government in this country as their other principal rivals? And that's what happens this May is going to give us a first indication whether they can do that. More broadly on Runcorn, yes, we've had one poll. There's been some debate about its accuracy. Certainly, I think we're looking to Reform to do well in this by-election. Whether or not they can win it, well, who knows? But certainly bear in mind, when UKIP under Nigel Farage's leadership were fighting by-elections in the Parliament before 2015, the only ones they were ever able to win were ones where defecting Tory MPs stood down and refought their seats. If they did actually manage to win Runcorn, this would be the first time that they've managed to win a seat afresh in a by-election.
So that would be fairly seismic. So
it would be a notable moment. Yeah.
What do you make of these talk of unite the right? A lot of people in the Conservative Party who lost their seats, lost their jobs in government, who argue that with Reform there, no matter what level of support they've got, we are going to have a divided right wing in this country, and that means we're going to get another Labour landslide, maybe not as big as it has been this time round, but another big Labour majority in the next election, because if the right wing vote is split, then that's what happens. What do you think the likelihood is of that result happening, another Labour landslide, no matter how unpopular Labour government, and B, what would a unite the right campaign look like that would actually, deliver for either of those parties?
Oh, OK. I mean, I wouldn't be putting too much money on a Labour landslide at this point in time, given that Labour support's fallen more rapidly, more quickly than any newly elected government in British history. So let's park that one for a while. Sure, the division on the right is important. I don't think anything's going to happen in the short run for two obvious reasons. One is Nigel Farage was on the record as saying he would only go back into British politics, which he decided to do in the middle of the election campaign, if he thought there was a chance of displacing the Conservatives as the principal party of the right. So Nigel Farage, I think at the moment, will be concerned to try and demonstrate that his party could actually replace the Conservatives. Kemi Badenoch, although many people regard her as on the right of the Conservative Party, is very clearly of the view that she doesn't want to be dealing with Reform, and she reckons that under her leadership she can turn things around. And of course we are going to get the beginning of an internal party consultation tomorrow, which is the direction in which she is proposing to go. So neither leader is going to be keen on this point in time, which is part of the reason why, therefore, in fact, this Unite the Right movement at the moment seems to be, to some degree, pressure inside the Conservative Party to perhaps change that stance. But I think we're going to have to wait for a fair while until we see what is the result of what at the moment, yes, will be something of a war of attrition between Conservative and Reform before we see whether anything happens between now and the election.
But neither side is going to sort of make any nicey moves until they feel that they need to, unless or until. What has been the impact of these battles going on between Nigel Farage and Rupert Lowe? Was one of his 5 MPs, no longer a Reform MP. In fact, now the Gaza group of MPs now has more MPs than Reform does. What do you make of that battle? Has there been much impact? Because there was some interesting polling that suggested, even I think 7 out of 10 Reform voters didn't actually recognise a picture of Rupert Lowe. With all due respect to him and a lot of the great campaigning he's done, actually most people weren't paying attention to this. But has it had an impact?
I think it's difficult to discern an impact so far. If you look at the polls that have been done since this story broke, yes, I think I can find you one where Reform is down, but I can then find you a couple of others where it's up very slightly. I think more broadly what is true is that probably the rise in Reform support began to tail off at the end of, towards the end of last month. That's in February. They seem now to be at about 25%, and they now seem to be sticking at around 25%. So I think the question that faces Reform now is, as it were, have they reached the peak Reform? Have they maxed out at least the group of people that they've been managing to appeal to during the course of the 6 months? They've had 6 months of pretty much continuous growth. It may just be now that that's come to a halt, but certainly I don't see any signs so far of any marked decline in Reform support.
I mean, it's a very interesting time in British politics, but again, it's all very different, isn't it, from what's been happening in Europe, where, of course, they do have proportionate representation. But then even then, we've often seen parties that don't make the sort of the Georgia Maloney's party and others which have made the jump into power, but they often are frozen out by centre-right and centre-left and hard left, basically keeping them out of power.
Well, look, Julia, virtually all of what we used to call Western Europe, i.e. before the Berlin Wall, has seen a fundamental change in the party system, the parties that voters are choosing between during the course of the last 20, 30 years. The UK has been quite remarkable hitherto in there not being that change. The July election raised the question as to whether or not the Conservative and Labour duopoly was now facing a bigger challenge than ever before. Reform is part of that story, but so also are the Greens. Oh, by the way, the Liberal Democrats are up a bit as well now in the opinion polls. The truth is we've got a more fragmented electorate than we've had for some, well, frankly, ever since the 1920s. And we do indeed live in interesting times, and none of us quite know how this is going to play out.
Just to let you know, by the way, we've just been keeping an eye on the Reform press conference. Nigel Farage has been speaking, but to Zia Youssef, the Reform chairman, he has said that Reform is going to stand candidates in all 1,600 seats which are at stake on May the 1st. What do you make of that?
That will be important if it is indeed they do manage to find all these candidates. And if they do so, it will in itself be an indication that Reform's project of beginning to turn itself into a political party with a regular local party organisation everywhere, something the Eurosceptic right have hitherto failed really to achieve, that they're making progress on that. So that in itself will be important. And then the question will be, how well do these candidates do? Many of them, of course, may well be novices and, may find fighting local elections maybe in some cases a bit more difficult than they anticipate. But then, do they indeed then manage to pick up a significant vote and be a significant number of seats?
It's going to be absolutely fascinating. Oh, now we both love our politics, and it's always good when things aren't always obvious, because we keeps us both in a job. Sir John Curtice, polling expert, Professor of Politics, University of Strathclyde, and all-round guru on elections. Always so good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Sam Armstrong, really interesting what he has to say on all of those topics, but it is going to be fascinating to see how well or not well Reform do. That's kind of where everyone's looking. But the future, Kemi Badenoch, your Tory party leader, that is going to rest on how well another party does.
Yeah, I think Reform have got unlucky with actually the exact council elections that have been cancelled.
The 9 that have been cancelled are the ones which would have been strong Reform.
These were all Conservative areas, but just 2, for example, that have been cancelled, Kent and Essex, both of which are the kinds of councils that a resurgent or an upcoming Reform party that was on its way to Downing Street would be hoping to take.
Those elections will happen in, say, a year's time. However, it's about momentum, isn't it? It's about being seen to be pushing on.
That's right. And actually, actually, in some ways, I mean, it might be the best thing that ever happens to reform, which is that they get a good result this year, but then next year coming up, they've got not only all of these held back councils that they're likely to do very good at, but also the Welsh elections next year.
Yeah.
And that is the biggest test of British politics over the next couple of years. What happens in Wales? Because it is absolutely possible, it's absolutely possible, looking at polls, that Wales could go reform. And then you've got potentially a reform First Minister, certainly the largest party in the Senate, from reform, and then all bets are off.
It's going to be absolutely fascinating. Never ever tell me that politics is boring.